Well, hello, Pittsburgh. David, how you doing today?
I am doing fine as long as I stay inside. It is ridiculously cold out today, and I have become weak in my old age, but here we are. How are things there?
It's a sunny day. I think we're about to get hit by an ice storm, though. But by the time this airs, everything will be balmy.
It will be spring by then.
Well, I've got a question for you. You're on a desert island, needing a source of musical culture discovery. You're back in the 80s. What is it you can't do without?
I mean, I guess it would have to be WLIR radio out of Long Island getting me through that situation. But what about you, Dave?
For me, it would be the Compact Disc Emporium, the CD Emporium in East Lansing, Michigan.
All right. Well, that brings us to the start of Stupid Gen X Tricks, the podcast about Gen X culture, why it mattered then and why it matters now. Alternate subtitle, the show for people who used to be cool. This is episode 3 with the exciting title, Cultural Discovery in the Analog Age. And the idea is really, obviously, the world that we grew up in as people who loved music and movies, in your case, fashion and other things that were maybe not quite in the mainstream. It was harder to find stuff. It was harder to discover what you liked in those days than it seems to be maybe now, when everything in the world is available at the tip of your fingers through various online media. Argument to be made maybe in the other direction that, there's too much drinking from a fire hose now and you can't really find what you want because it's all just a big wash. But we're going to get into that. I'm getting ahead of the topic, talking about what it was like then, what it was like now. We have an amazing guest lined up for today. I think we should just get into it.
All right. Well, so that guest is Brandon Schmidt, and I'll talk more about him in a second, but let's flesh out a little bit why those early essentials. Tell me about WLIR.
So LIR was the radio station. As I said, it was out on Long Island. For those who know New York geography, I lived in Westchester County, north of the city. So we were actually right on the edge of their listening area. I can remember actually driving around town where I live with my friends, and we knew kind of right where the signal would drop off because we were going down a hill a little bit, and then it would kick back up when we came back in. You had to have a good receiver to get it. But the rest of what was on radio and what was starting to be on MTV at that point, there was pop and there was classic rock. And I listened to the classic rock station a fair amount, but then when we discovered LIR, they were playing new music, a lot of the music that was coming out of England at the time.
You remember a band you discovered down there?
Who was the band? I mean, the Smiths probably, right? Would not have heard on other radio stations, certainly at that point, and they played a lot of, I remember actually Prefab Sprout as a group that developed a weird liking for in those days that was straight off of LIR. It was just great to have that alternative, have that view into a different world. It had that sort of locality and culture building that radio stations can have, where they, started advertising lots of shows by local bands, mostly on Long Island, that I wasn't going to go to. But the fact that it was there was really cool.
You were lucky. I did not have such a thing. That in my hometown, a station like that did appear, but it was a little bit later. I think I was already in college or even post-college. But yeah, so discovery was critical. I mean, you needed to use special tactics to go find new stuff. And there were plenty of people who were happy with the mainstream. That's what made it the mainstream. But if you were looking for something more and had a sense that there was something more, which is also important, you needed those cues, whether it was a friend or a record store or a radio station or whatever.
And there was fun in that, right? There was fun in the search. And,
yes.
Your record store, I think, is probably a good example of that.
Yes. And it wasn't a record store. There wasn't a bit of vinyl in the place. CD Emporium was the first of its kind. And I don't remember seeing much of this kind, which was a store that was only compact discs. And that was back when I would say 10% of my friends had CD players. It was a low number. It was
And what year are we talking about here?
I'm going to say 85, 86. Like, they were around and they were getting
You were still early adopters at that point, though, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, it was like a little beyond early adopters, but not like total mainstream. And so what was so cool about CD Emporium was that when you went in there, they had like a bar that was quite long and a bunch of stools, kind of like a bar, except that at each stool was a CD player and a pair of headphones. And what you do is you'd walk around the place picking out CDs you were interested in. Then you'd go to the counter. The CD cases, they weren't in those packs. They were loose, but there was no disc in the holder. So you'd hand them the empty case and they'd go fish it out of the back, like going to the library kind of. And then they'd give you whatever number of
That's
CDs
cool.
you'd asked for. Yeah, it was incredible. So you could basically just sample music over and over, which you couldn't do there was no way.
And did they let you stay for hours, or did they
Yeah.
get pissy about it?
Like, you could tell they get a little annoyed, but as long as they knew you were a regular customer and you would buy stuff, then they were less pissy, unless it was a new employee who didn't get that that's what you were. So I'd have friends who'd be like, you got to listen to this. And I'd go in there and I'd be like, okay, give me this thing. I'd never heard of it. And I'd listen to it and be like, great. I remember that is literally how I first listened to Front 242, the industrial act that I loved. And then also artwork, like the cool artwork that you'd see would tell you something about the kind of band it might be. So if it was like kind of edgy and interesting, I'd be like, all right, this artwork is interesting. Let's hear what they sound like. So
I definitely am. And I'm trying to think of an example off my head, but absolutely like bought records just based on the album cover.
Yeah.
And frankly, still would if I bought records these days. I buy books that way.
All right. Well, time for our guest, right?
It is time for our guest. I think we are going to use the magic of the internet to just bring him right into our little conversation here. Add a third talking head.
Brandon.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, Brandon. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, David. Hey, Dave.
Hey. All right. So glad you can join us, and apt that you can join from, well, tell the millions where you're joining us from.
I am joining from Maplewood, New Jersey, and more specifically from Soma Sounds Records, which is a record store that I co-own and operate here in Maplewood in the New York
Maplewood's
suburbs
like
of New
Brooklyn
Jersey.
South, right?
Yeah, some might call it that.
I'm realizing that, Dave, we in our newbie podcasterdom have mentioned Brandon's name a few times, but not really given him the fulsome introduction that he deserves. And since you have known him even longer than you've known me, go to it.
All right, Brandon, you'll correct me on anything that I have way off here. But if not mistaken, you grew up in a musical family in Havertown, Pennsylvania. And
Correct.
It was very classical oriented. Everyone in the family was a musician. Brandon worked in record stores, did promotion, played in bands, ended up eventually at MTV. I skipped over the part where we met, which was at Oberlin College, where we did lots of musical stuff together. We're roommates and so on and so forth. Then there for the rise of MTV Online, and then started doing A&R, a term that some of our listeners will know and some won't, so maybe you can explain that. Eventually landing a managing gig for a band you kind of discovered, Interpol, who are rock gods and favorites of many people who may listen to this and have stayed in the industry ever since, including a second gig that you're doing these days, which we may or may not have time to hear about, but is an intriguing one as well. Did I get that right?
You did.
I think you nailed it. Yeah.
Awesome.
I don't know why I'm saying I think you nailed it. But.
Yeah, shockingly, you actually got that right, Dave.
Well,
he was paying attention all these years. So the theme we're exploring today on Stupid Gen X Tricks is this idea of musical discovery and how you found the things that you loved back then in particular, and we'll talk a little bit about today too, but growing up around classical music and finding yourself into the indie world, just how did you make that journey?
That's a great question.
Teenager.
So yeah, I like to My dad had a huge record collection. He was a music historian. My grandfather was a conductor. My mom's a pianist. I didn't have older brothers and sisters, but I do have a twin brother. So whereas a lot of kids in our generation would have been discovering music from their older siblings' friends, like I didn't have that luxury. And my parents, although my dad had a huge record collection, they didn't own any or listen to any rock music. They didn't listen to anything really apart from classical music. So at that time, it was discovering things at record stores, through magazines, through older kids in school, the radio. Luckily I grew up outside Philadelphia, so there was college radio. So WKDU, which is Drexel University radio station, was a good way to hear things that were outside the mainstream. And then getting older, starting to work in record stores and go to shows and things like that were really the ways to discover. I mean, I can get far more specific on some stuff.
Can you remember any particular early acts and a person or a place where you discovered them?
I'm not even sure how I got to discovering certain things, like as a younger kid. I mean, I remember I used to joke that I went to more classical concerts by age 10 than most people have gone to concerts in their lifetime. But Sean Cassidy and Billy Joel and things that just kind of like were part of the 70s. I don't know how I would have first heard them. Like those are things that had early musical memories. But the things that really started me on my path, I remember when my brother came home from a summer music camp, and this must have been 7th, 8th grade, and here he was getting to meet and spend time with kids from all over the country who were coming in with their own, and older kids and discovering things through them. And he came home, and it kind of was the segue from going from just whatever everybody was listening to in junior high at that time to discovering Howard Jones and Depeche Mode and like these new wave acts that kind of then put me on a path to carving out things that I liked as opposed to just things that everybody around me was listening to. As much as John Hughes wants you to think that like growing up in the 1980s high school, like there were all these like cool alternative kids running around, wasn't really the case where I went to school. So, it really was just kind of like finding these things on our own and then having that kind of help carve the path and lead us into what each of those things kind of introduced us to. Right, from Howard Jones and Depeche Mode, then it was kind of discovering things like Bauhaus and Joy Division and New Order and so on and so forth. And, that all kind of spoked out into lots of different pathways that you could follow.
So how old were you when you finally landed a record store gig?
I was probably, I guess it was before I was driving. So I would have been, 14, 15.
Wow. So you were working at Repo or Plastic Fantastic as a...
Plastic Fantastic, yeah, because Repo was after college. Plastic Fantastic I was doing as like summer jobs and things while I was still in high school.
Was it the kind of place where, they were sort of deliberately, I always loved the scene from the movie version of High Fidelity where he's like, puts on the Beta Band album and is like, I'm going to sell 3 of these. And they actually do. Was it that kind of scene? And I can remember being on the receiving end of that kind of thing, definitely.
The first place, Plastic Fantastic, was not. It was a fairly large secondhand store with a fantastic jazz section. There was a guy on staff who was like a Blue Note expert, and he dealt in all things jazz. There was another guy, full-time guy who worked there, who like he was there because he knew every nuance of the Beatles like LP world, pressings and stampers and all kinds of marginalia. It wasn't a super fun place to work. It had started out as kind of a guy who worked in the music biz who I think was just finding a place to offload a lot of records that he was getting from the back of a truck, so to speak, lots of cutouts and lots of promos and things of that nature. I had started by this point, in high school discovering Repo records where like I was buying posters and, seeing, that was where I was seeing things for the first time that was outside of what you would find in your more traditional mall record store. And so that's where getting to start to work there and really be more a part of what the store carried and what we ordered, and having more direct relationships with customers, that was a much more exciting time and much closer to the high fidelity, sort of, or Pretty in Pink, those sorts of romanticized record store moments.
Yeah, absolutely. So in between your record store experiences, you spent 4 years with Dave Anderson at Oberlin College.
Yeah,
Tell us
four calendar years, but between time away that we each spent from campus, it wasn't like 4 years together, which is, sad to look back on, but at the same time, it was a great time while we were there.
Yeah, I'm just recalling one of your periods away was spent in a Le Pen supporting French household with a future TV star. Tell David about that.
Yes, I was on a study abroad program in France, and so there were about 16 of us or so from Oberlin on the program, and we were paired with host families, and 2 of us from the program were housed with the family that were, yes, the father supported Le Pen Sr., and a classmate of mine was Rex Lee, who ended up being Lloyd on Entourage.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, Ari Gold's assistant.
He's a great character, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. It's fun to see him on TV and think about the time we spent living with this. I mean, as you can imagine, one thing I'll say is, Rex and Lloyd had shared some similar personality characteristics, and, being a, fun, energetic Asian man in a Le Pen supporting household in France in the early 90s was probably less comfortable for him than you'd want to expect.
Yeah.
All right, so we should talk about Concert Board. Let's see. We had already met when we joined Concert Board, right? Because we were on the same hall and then ditched our roommates.
Yeah. So Concert Board at Oberlin was the student-run committee that booked and promoted concerts on campus. Very early on, we signed up to at least participate after one of the early orientation concerts or something. If I recall, I got elected in as the finance person on the committee, and we kind of slowly started to take over, you becoming the booking coordinator, and we were left to our own devices to pick and choose what we wanted to bring to campus, which started a fantastic run. We had the luxury of people who had come before us who had booked acts like, REM with English Beat at Finney Chapel in the mid-'80s.
As a double bill.
Sonic
Wow,
Youth with
that's
Big
great.
Black, and all kinds of great stuff. But, the list of artists that we brought to campus was pretty great when you look back on it. And we really tried to cover not just what we liked, but we really did pay attention to what the community was looking for. So, everything from Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie and Coco Taylor and James Cotton to Robin Hitchcock and Firehose and the Pixies and Fish and the Toasters and Bim Scala Bim and all kinds of fun stuff that we did.
Brandon, mentioning REM and wait, who was this? The second half, English Beat. Yeah, in the Beat. So that was a double-edged sword, that show, because it kind of hung over us. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously wasn't there for the show itself, but the lingering issue was that show had been booked into Finney Chapel, which is a beautiful chapel with pews, and
great.
Apparently there was, the audience caused several $1,000s worth of damage to the pews during the concert, and so the college maintained a pretty anti-rock music in Finney Chapel stance for a long time.
English Beat fans were always known for their rowdiness, right? And it doesn't really seem like a show that you're going to get people ripping out the church pews from. But
I want to go back though real quick. The best kind of the benefit that we got from being close to Cleveland, or the highlight for me, and I'm sure Dave you would agree, the highlight of being close to Cleveland was, so when we booked the Pixies on the Trompe Le Monde tour, Cleveland's own Per Ubu was the support act on that tour. And
Cool.
So that was a pretty cool thing to have a band that had, kind of started in Cleveland, so close to home, playing with a band that was really kind of at the heights of their popularity in the alternative scene. But on the day of the show, talking to the tour manager, and he was going through needs prior to the show, and he said, I'm going to need guest passes and bus parking for David Bowie and the crew of Tin Machine, who happened to be playing in Cleveland the next night. And they, at the time, were playing a cover of Debaser, so they were obviously Pixies fans. So sure enough, showtime, the Tin Machine bus rolls in, and David Bowie and several of the members of Tin Machine and crew
That's
come into the
awesome.
show and stand in the midst of students and, chatted, and it was pretty great.
That is super cool. A college experience. Curious, you mentioned, sort of serving the people who had different tastes than you. How do you calculate how much of that you need to do and how much you're doing it for yourselves?
We had a survey. That was one thing. So every year there would be a concert board survey that was sent out to students, and we took it very seriously. And so you literally could list a bunch of acts and people could vote on which acts they wanted to see the following year. And it was something where sometimes it would validate, because inside concert board, there'd be people who were really advocating for certain acts. Hot Tuna springs to mind. There was one person in particular who really always wanted Hot Tuna above everything else.
That's unfortunate, but yeah.
Yeah, well, they did not make it to campus, partly because they did not get very many votes on the survey. On the other hand, a band like the Pixies didn't get many votes either, and we just were like, the Pixies matter, we're going to book them. So I think there was a curatorial aspect to it. We wanted to satisfy the people, and then we also wanted to find a hybrid where people would be happy we booked them even if they didn't know them at the time.
Yeah, I think the curatorial thing is an interesting point because, we were basically programming music activities for students. I think that's how we, kind of found ourselves in a position to oftentimes find, new up and coming things that, were, poised to break out. Even though we, oftentimes missed on those opportunities, like when we said no to Pearl Jam for $500.
I stick by that decision to this day. Though we may have deprived some others who would have liked to have seen them. Brandon, tell David about how your affection for the Spin Doctors grew after their time at Oberlin.
Yeah, that show, we booked a show with the Spin Doctors in the early stages of the rise of Two Princes as a radio hit. And it was one of those things where we probably booked the show, months prior to the date. And between the booking and the actual show date, a lot had happened for them. They started to get a lot of attention. And when they arrived on campus, I think they didn't really think that our venue was where they should be at that point in their careers. And so they did just about everything they could to make it known that they were not going to play the show. So we were left scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. There were a lot of kids from New York who went to Oberlin who kind of knew of the band from playing at Wetlands and various places. So there was a lot of anticipation and excitement for the show. And we ended up talking to local campus band who were scheduled to open. And we said, we'll give you the headlining slot and pay you more money if you will just fill in. And they did a great job. I for the life of me, I can't remember who that band was, but they filled in, they did a great job. And we ultimately, I think, turned the tide to like everybody being happy that we kind of did the show that way and were not upset by the fact that the band wasn't there. They kind of heard the story and they sided with us. So
that's good. It's disappointing to hear. I heard that song recently I don't think I had thought about them in 30 years. And the song came on somewhere and it was like just great nostalgia. Like it's a banger. Yeah.
But sometimes it doesn't ring true when they've screwed over your friends and so forth. So
it is always disappointing.
We did have some classmates that we didn't know super well, but were interesting music types. Liz Phair was a year ahead of us, I believe, and John McIntyre, the legendary drummer, who I don't even know if I ever caught sight of the guy. I just remember there being tales of different people trying to get him to join their bands, like putting notes on his door and stuff like that. But did you ever catch sight of him, Brandon?
Oh, I was one of those people. I flyered all around his dorm room and hallway and any place where I thought he might be walking from his dorm room.
What was for people?
I'm not even sure what we were trying to accomplish because I didn't really have a band, but I think there were some other people
If you
that I
had
was
John
friends with.
McIntyre, you would have had a
Yeah,
band.
then we would have made a band.
Any stories of the undergraduate Lids Fair that could make us go viral and gain us viewership?
Not for me. I mean, I think we just really overlapped for a very brief period of time. But it was Liz Fair was somebody I came to know after my Oberlin time, not during.
You got to know her?
No, no. I mean, just I came to know of her.
Speaking of post Oberlin time, we should get to that. So, talk a little bit about like pre MTV and then MTV.
I moved back to Philadelphia thinking that I was going to head out to Los Angeles because I wanted to pursue a job in the music business. Went back to working at the record store full time before making the move, and met some guys through a former orchestra mate of mine who he had told me he'd started playing in a band with these guys. And next thing you know, my friend quit the band and they were like, "Oh, you should join." I was like, "Well, I don't play bass." I'm like, "Yeah, you can figure it out." So the LA idea went by the wayside, and I ended up staying in Philly, working at the store, playing in this band. You know, being at the store afforded opportunities of, knowing the promoters at local concert venues and knowing when things were coming up. So when shows that were interesting to us that we thought maybe would be a good pairing came about, it was like, hey, I'd submit to the booker of the show because they were calling me every week to coordinate ticket giveaways with the store.
Right.
And that's pretty much how we got to open for Oasis at JC Dobbs on their first US tour, and bands like Adorable and stuff that at the time I was super into. But the Philadelphia music world didn't really offer the opportunities to make many advances on the business side of things. So it was actually through you, Dave, the opportunity to come up to New York and work at MTV, during the Choose or Lose campaign. And so when that opportunity presented itself, I jumped at that chance because I figured, oh, well, once I'm at MTV, maybe I can figure out how to get more involved on the music side of things. And boy, was that a silly mistake.
We should just take a second to describe what Choose or Lose was and how Dave was responsible for engaging the youth of America.
Yeah, so Choose or Lose was MTV's campaign for youth voter engagement. People often get it confused with Rock the Vote. Rock the Vote was actually a separate organization that MTV coordinated with, and we had a Rock the Vote person on the Choose or Lose bus with us. But basically, it was a big bus, traveled across America, registered kids to vote, turned up in MTV news and marketing coverage. And, throughout the year, we were registering people to vote. We had an 800 number for people to call in, and that was manned by a friend of ours named Dan Torinas, who then moved on and left an opening for Brandon to come from Philadelphia and take on that job, and then did a great job with that. But what was much more important was what came after. So talk a little bit about MTV Online and how that grew.
Yeah, so obviously the Choose or Lose campaign had a natural end date. Once the election came and went, there really wasn't any more need for the bus to be traveling around. So I knew that the writing was on the wall that come November, I needed to figure out something to do next. So I started petitioning various members of the MTV staff as to what opportunities might exist. David Cohn, who had been running MTV marketing, suggested that maybe the new department, MTV Online, might present an interesting opportunity. I explored that idea and sure enough got hired on to join a team of people that was helping to produce localized content that would go out with the national feed of MTV. For every local break, they were looking for specific local content that they could feed into the top 75 media markets across the country. There were three of us kind of on the ground responsible for coordinating content coming in from media partners. And that was my role, to work with radio stations and independent newspaper publications to kind of bring in record reviews and scene reports and concert previews lists of local bands on the locals only show on the radio station, and like what were the top most added records or what, that sort of stuff. And then we had another person who was responsible for dealing with basically interns. We'd hire college students as interns, and they became our stringers in each of these markets, and they would write, things specific. So we didn't necessarily have somebody in every market, so there were times when we had to kind of fill in the gaps. And so I ended up having to write, stuff. And it was through that I then got some other opportunities that are relevant to this discussion about music discovery. So the localized content was all being done in conjunction with MTV2, which at the time was still just known as M2. And M2 was where basically 24 hours of music video programming at that time.
MTV had already made the pivot to
MTV was starting to do more long form programming. And this was pre TRL, but still like in the late 90s period. So because my byline was showing up in these local content breaks, and every record label basically had Mbon in their office all day. So people started seeing names, and somebody reached out to me from Epic Records about doing some A&R consulting work for them, because I had a line into young bands in all these different markets around the country.
Explain what A&R means.
So A&R, traditionally artists and repertoire, they're the people who are signing bands to the record label. It stems from back in the day when you partnered the artist with the song, but these days it has more to do with, it still has to do with that, because not all artists are songwriters themselves, but the A&R people are the ones who are kind of scouting, finding bands, bringing them into the label, and then signing them to a record deal.
It struck me that you're a guy who has basically made a career out of having a reputation for having good taste, right? And for being somebody who people look at and say, yeah, I trust that guy's judgment about bands, about other things. Is that something that sort of comes naturally? Is that something that you cultivate? Is that something that matters to you?
No, that's a great insight into it. I think it does matter to me. I like to tell people that I made a career out of being the kid who sat in my bedroom reading front to back every album sleeve, every liner note, everything having to do with the bands that I was listening to the point where, I started to connect the dots and see, oh, this person worked on this and this person came from that. And then able to use that information when I found myself in situations that I was lucky to find myself in once I started getting into these jobs, where I'd be introduced into a situation where it was like, oh, here's an artist manager and the head of marketing from the record label. And to be able to talk intelligently about what's going on and know who these people are because you've seen their names and you've followed their career a little bit.
They're impressed when you know their backstory, right?
Yeah, I think it just kind of tells them that you're somebody who's serious about what you're doing. And I think it helps to just kind of develop that trust, David, that you were talking about, like how it's kind of interesting because as we move forward in time, as the internet started to kind of be the vehicle for discovery and blogs kind of taking the place of traditional music journalism, one thing that I always struggled with was when you read Rolling Stone and you read the byline that it was a David Frick article or review, you knew that there was a long history of somebody who knew where music had come from and the path that it had followed. When the blogosphere exploded, you had no idea who was writing these things. Was the person writing this review, was their first exposure to music weeks ago, right? Did they understand the connections and did they get the, right? And I'm not saying that one is necessarily better than the other, but at that time, just to be able to kind of...
I'll say that one is better than the other, but that's just me.
Being knowledgeable and having an understanding kind of what led to what and how, I've always been a fan of understanding not just the music, but also I've been kind of a student of the business side of things. So it's always intrigued me kind of like the movers and the shakers and how they got things done and how things changed over time, right? How people managing bands in the 60s, right? You can read all these great bios of Andrew Loog Oldham managing the Stones and Peter Grant and Led Zeppelin and whatnot. The things they were doing at that time didn't necessarily fly, 20, 30 years later, but getting the gist of kind of how they looked at things and why they made the decisions they made and what they were taking into account, certainly there was something to glean from in there.
Talk about the notebook or the notebooks.
Yeah, so this was something that I had told Dave in our kind of pre-meetup, and I did desperately try and find an example, but I just can't figure out where it is. So in this kind of, during this time I was at MTV and actively doing stuff kind of in the music scene around New York, there was a lot coming at me. Like there was a lot of reading about stuff, hearing about stuff, talking to people either in MTV or from publicists or record labels that I was dealing with, or reading press. And there was a lot of stuff that I was hearing about, upcoming releases, new bands, what have you. And so to try and keep some track of it, I just would write notes in pretty much anything that I could write on. So if it was, back before you had an iPhone, you had some sort of like day planner, like I had lists of concerts that I wanted to see, concerts that I had seen, right? And I had like little systems of making, check marks and underlining and circling or crossing out or whatever. But the same thing went for music. I'm the kind of person that can't remember what I have in my record collection, so I end up buying the same thing over and over again. Or I walk into a record store and I have no idea what to look for. So having a list was always helpful. Right? So I kept this little list of, okay, I read about this band somewhere, like I want to check it out, right? And like I said, I had all these little notations that told me what to do. So, with the notebook that I was looking for specifically is the one where I had Interpol for the first time, because I'd read a little show preview in Time Out magazine, Time Out New York, and I was like, oh, right. So I wrote it down. Sounds interesting. And then I fired up Napster, and I was like, I'll listen to something. And I listened to it, and so I was like, oh, this is good.
Admitting to theft right here on the podcast.
So I circled it or check marked it or whatever it was. And then it was like, all right, when are they playing next? Right. And then it was like, go to see them and so on and so forth. So,
well
yeah, I was trying
explain and so on and so forth. Cause I think this is an important part of the story here.
Yeah. So the yada yada moment. So, at this time at MTV, I had risen to a position where that localized programming thing kind of ran its course and evolved into just much more synergistic programming across MTV, MTV2, and MTV.com. As the internet started to take hold and MTV.com started to grow, there was a real debate internally as to what was music on MTV.com going to be. From my perspective, I was looking for there to be more interactivity with videos and with downloads and with debuting new songs or videos, which differed from the approach that others wanted to take, which was much more like falling under the MTV News sort of approach. By this point, I started to kind of run the music programming side of MTV.com. But as the internet continued to get bigger and bigger, it became harder and harder to move a big company in, kind of the nimble paced internet speeds, getting the senior executives to decide on streaming versus downloading. Those conversations dragged on and on and on. So now this is all kind of looking back on it. I don't think I was necessarily thinking all these things at the time, but every day things would come across my desk and it was like, what are we going to do as MTV.com to support this new record or this artist or this priority for the channel? And it was kind of like, do the thing, move it to the side, the next thing, right? The next thing came, like move to the side, the next thing. I didn't really feel like I was getting too hands-on with any one thing. So, like I said, I had this list. I went to see Interpol because they had piqued my interest from what I'd heard. And I was like, wow, these guys are really good. I think I could help them. And like, what could I do? Like, I know some people in the business. I know some record labels. I know people who, like would like this kind of music. I know some DJs who host nights at various venues in different cities that play music that this would fit with. And so I bought their EP after the show, and I contacted the email address on the back of that EP to say, hey, like, I'd love to sit down and talk to you guys about, whether you have a manager and are looking for a manager and whatnot. So got a response, met up with a couple of the guys, and, spent the next couple months courting them, I guess, trying to explain to them why somebody who'd never managed a band would be able to help. And we talked about what we could do. And after a few months, including me having to go to London to kind of surprise them on a trip that they'd booked themselves to go, do a couple dates over there to prove to them that I was serious. When I just kind of showed up at one of the gigs, they were like, oh, okay, like, let's give him a shot. So then I started, while working at MTV and doing that job, I started helping to develop and launch the career for Interpol.
So I'm not giving away any spoilers here that they made it. They made it big. They were a big hit. Talk about that ride. I mean, how did it feel to be in the middle of it, and how does something like that almost mechanically happen?
It was incredible. I mean, it was not what any of us necessarily expected or had planned, but it was kind of a remarkable time to be, not only having the success, but to be part of what was a pretty important, scene of music, just kind of what was going on in New York in the early 2000s. There were a lot of bands, there was a lot of attention. And I think there was a real moment, that you can look back on and say, like, that moment left a mark. Martin Mills, who is the founder and chairman of Beggars Group, Beggars Banquet label, and 4AD, and all these labels that had a huge impact on my musical life and my desire to get into doing what I do. Beggars Group did a deal with Matador Records, who Interpol had signed to. So Martin was responsible for the label that was putting stuff out in the UK. And when he pulled me aside and told me that the rise of Interpol in the UK, at least from his perspective, was like a storybook, that it was exactly what you would write out if you could script it to happen. Hearing that from somebody who had the level of success and had worked with a number of influential and important artists.
Which ones?
Well, he was outside of the United States. He had signed Adele. He had done, everything from all of the 4AD bands, Cocteau Twins and Dead Can Dance and Pixies, but then Gary Newman and The Birthday Party and on and on. So that was meaningful to me to hear that from somebody that I respected at that level.
Were you carrying a cricket bat around at that point? Was it that kind of crazy scene?
No, there was nothing quite at that level. We did have the experience of our first trip to Japan, having fans like camped out at the airport and then like outside the hotel and things like that, which is, I think, pretty much what anyone would kind of hope to have happen. And it really did. But no, during my time working with the band, things never got crazy out of hand in any situation like that. They were always very approachable and had a lot of time to give back to fans as best they could within reason.
So you guys played a lot of dates with opening acts. You played festivals. I'm curious, in all your time touring with them and being at some of these big shows, what other artists' performances stuck out to you from those tour days? Or did you not have time to pay attention to the others because you were attending to them the whole time?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Interestingly, during my time working with Interpol, we headlined everything from the jump. Their first US tour was a headlining tour, and we never went on tour as a support act, with the exception of some bigger things like when we joined the Curiosa tour that The Cure headlined, and Robert Smith had curated all the bands on that 2-stage traveling tour. And then one-off things like opening for U2 in Glasgow or opening for Coldplay in Dublin and London. Everything else was headline. To your question, Dave, like what was interesting and what connects back to a lot of the conversation we've been having is we were getting to choose who the opening band was that went on tour with Interpol. That was a real position of not just power, but getting to pick things that we liked and help people that we liked or respected. Some of that kind of fell to me to help curate to the band so that, I mean, they weren't going to listen to every submission or every possible thing that any booking agent wanted to throw our way. There were things that they naturally gravitated to liking themselves, like a band like Spoon, who toured at various times with Interpol. Paul was friendly with members of Rat-a-Tat, who did some early touring. So
what are you looking for in that dynamic, right? Is it like these guys are going to really get the crowd fired up? Is it just this will make a great show and we want to do like what are the different considerations? Yeah, what's the math?
Well, it depends on kind of who the headlining act is and what the venues and tour routing is and kind of like what you're looking for. So a lot of the calculus will be like, what do they add to the bill? How many tickets can they sell on their own? In some of the cases, and I'm not saying this to sound like a jerk, but there were often times where we didn't necessarily rely on the support band to be selling a lot of tickets. So it really afforded us an opportunity to just pick things that we thought made a great night of music and paired well with what Interpol was doing. Or just, things that we wanted to do because we wanted to do it. So I can't speak to, post my time, but certainly as the band got bigger, then we did start to face those considerations of, if we're playing 2 nights at Radio City Music Hall, maybe one night we have one support act and one night we have a different support act so that we could make sure that we were getting any additional ticket support as we could. But that was really kind of the way that we approached it.
Are there any openers that you picked yourself that you got the band to go along with that you're particularly pleased about?
There was nothing that was a single-handed decision. Everything was, and nor would I have, ever kind of thought that was my position to just kind of put something on. Everything, even if it was my idea, I was working with the band Elephant, and I thought it would be a great idea and also a benefit to me personally and my management company to have Elephant touring with Interpol. But that wasn't something that I just, made happen on my own. That was something that the band decided they agreed with and they were cool with, and they ultimately made the call.
Have either of you ever gone to a show primarily because of the opening act?
Yes.
I can't remember. Who was yours, Brandon?
I went to see Radiohead open for Belly on the first time that they played Philadelphia. And I was going to see Radiohead. Not that I had any problem seeing Belly, but I was there, for the opening act. That's one that stands out. I'm sure there's
good call.
Countless others.
Yeah, that's
it's just fun. It's an interesting dynamic to think about.
Did you ever have a moment where you're sitting there doing something as the manager of this big band somewhere else in the world and just say to yourself, holy smokes, like, look at my life? Can you think of a time and a place where it was just like, this is beyond anything I could have imagined?
Yes, probably lots of those moments in time. So I'll tell one fun story, and this was just kind of is this reality? Is this really happening? So I mentioned that Interpol played some shows with Coldplay. So the show that they played in Dublin was at Slane Castle, which is an astoundingly beautiful outdoor concert site. And the day we arrived into Dublin was like picture postcard weather. And as we learned, the first nice, warm, non-raining day that they'd seen in Dublin in quite some time. The reason that that's important to the story is because when it was time for the bus to depart our hotel to head to the concert site to be there on time for sound check and setup, Carlos D decided that he wanted to stay a little longer at the hotel bar and join later. So the weather part is that all the taxi drivers in Dublin decided to take the day off to enjoy the sunshine. So when it came time, I stayed behind with Carlos to make sure that he got to the venue okay. And so when it came time for us to leave in what we thought was a respectable amount of time, there was not a car anywhere to be had. So we finally got some sort of car for hire, and we are on the highway out to the venue, and we are now sitting in concert traffic. And we're getting painfully close to not just missing sound check, but like missing the set time. So
Right.
I am on the phone with our tour manager as to like what's going on. And then he handed me over to a production manager who said, "Where are you?" And I'm like looking for road markers on the highway. And so we kept an open line of communication with the production manager, who sent a runner on a motorcycle the opposite direction on the highway to then make a U-turn and come and drive up alongside the taxi. Carlos got out of the back, handed a helmet, got on the back of the motorcycle, and off they went to the show.
That's awesome.
So by the time I got there, they were already on stage. So thankfully it all worked out. But, just kind of like, it's, just one of those moments of, being
great.
dumbfounded that this is kind of like what you have to do to make it, the show must go on.
Life on the road.
All right. Why don't we take a quick break and come back with a couple final questions?
So we are back, and let's now pivot a little bit from the biography and just talk a little bit about this idea of discovery. One of the things that struck me in the conversations that we were having, Dave, offline about this, I think certainly in our era, but I think maybe even more so now, is the role of the friend and the role of a guide and the role of you got to listen to somebody who you trust and who you know. And sometimes friends, sometimes it's a radio station, sometimes it's the guy you got to know in the local record store whose judgment you trust, or the writer, or whomever. How do people find those guides? I mean, then and now, who were your guides, Dave?
Me? Well, in the 80s, it would have been before college, some friends. I had a very close friend, still a close friend, named David Pearson. He was kind of the guy that tipped me towards new wave stuff. And then CD Emporium, I mentioned it before, Brandon, you weren't on yet, but it was a place where you could bring CDs up and they'd give you the disc and you could listen to them before buying them on headphones. And so that's how I discovered a ton of stuff. And I had a friend named Andrew Campbell who cued me to some things. He was a year older and was a really savvy music listener. And then a group of friends that, I kind of fell in with. So what about you, Brandon?
Yeah, a lot of similarity there. I also just wanted to say real quickly that we could go down a whole separate wormhole of like how record art was a gateway into discovery. And so I'll use that as just like a quick little, like, there was that aspect of it. Like sometimes I would just see something like I want to hear that because of what it looked like, and then kind of identifying certain designers and album, sleeve designers and stuff that
we got to do a record art episode.
But beyond that, there was regional press. Like, I know and I don't even know where the publications were coming from, but, for me, I remember, like Dave said, like Enemy and Melody Maker and the British weekly press, like those became more part of my world, like post-college when I was managing the record store, because I would order stuff from the UK distributors every week. But before that, it was magazines like B-Side and Reflex, even like Pulse magazine that Tower Records put out.
Right.
You could see charts and things like CMJ, and MTV's 120 Minutes was like a big barometer for me of discovery. The different hosts talking about things, even down to going to shows and seeing what patches or stencils were on people's jackets, like what shirts were they wearing,
absolutely.
like, what were the buttons.
Definitely explored bands based on other people's T-shirts.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going to see Peter Murphy at Trenton City Gardens and discovering a whole host of gothy bands that I'd never heard of because every leather jacket was stenciled, fully. I was starting to see Repetition and like, okay, here's some names I'm going to go check out. David, you made the point earlier of kind of being somebody, like having the role of being somebody who for other people, you're the source, right? Like a lot of my friends will come to me, talk about, oh, like you introduced me to this. Like, oh, I remember when you first told me this or played this for me or whatever. Then there's always going up the ladder. I remember living in Brooklyn and going out to different music related nights at different places around the city. I was friendly with a guy who took me to an event that ran for, 10 years or so as a weekly party called Weird. It was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn at the time. It then moved to the Lower East Side. But I remember walking in and sitting for 3 hours listening to a DJ spin music, and I couldn't identify a single thing that he played. And it was music that I liked and was attracted to. And
you were in the music business at the time.
Yeah, I was like, wow.
Yeah.
Like,
you didn't have Shazam.
Are a whole different level.
Yeah.
And for years, like I could go and if I knew 10% of what got played at the course of that night, I felt like accomplished. What's really fun for me now is, at the record store, there's that stereotype of the like opinionated, jaded record store clerk. And, at this point, I don't, I just like people engaging with music, right? It doesn't matter to me how you listen to it, what you're listening to. I think it's been such an important part of my life. And it's a passion that I really kind of came to have as a result of the, childhood that I have with my parents being musicians and just growing up around it, like really instilled in me a passion for the importance of music. Getting to talk to people about, my wife and I joke around that working at the record store for me is just, it's not work. It's getting to go and talk to people about records, right? And that's what I just like to do, right? And to be able to turn somebody on to something new. It's not trying to show off. It's not trying to be, I know more than you. It's more just like, hey, you're buying this, like, you should check this out. Or, people will start to ask questions and you start to notice patterns and you start to get to know the customers. And, and the number of kids that we get coming in and getting to see them just starting out on that journey is really exciting, really meaningful for me.
You reminded me of the moment you called me in DC, and I think you were working at Repo at this time. It was post-college, before New York. And you're like, listen, and you didn't do this much at all, I would say, with me, because we were so aligned in our music, and both, I was never quite as up as you, but I was doing a pretty good job of staying abreast of stuff. But you called me up and you're like, there's a band, you need to go buy this record. It's a band called Portishead. And I was like, okay, like I had no idea. And so I went down to DuPont Circle to Olson's, I think was the store. I asked about it. They didn't really know what I was talking about. And they had one copy. And I bought it. And I came home. I put it on. It was that first record. And I'm like, wow, like a whole new sound and an amazing act. And then fast forward, I don't know how many years it was, 5, 6 years later, they're doing, I think, a second record. And we find out we're both in New York at this point. And John Norris, one of the on-air MTV News guys, said to me, hey, someone gave me these tickets to this Portishead show tonight. Do you want them? I'm like, Portishead show? He's like, yeah, it's a surprise. They're unveiling a new record. They're doing it with like the New York Symphony Orchestra. They're going to play it live and record it. I was like, what? And at Roseland. And so, of course, you were the only call, and you were, of course, available. And we went down and sat in the audience. That, to this day, is one of the most magical musical performances I've ever seen, is like experiencing a band you love performing a new album nobody knew about with an orchestra with only like 100 people in the audience. It was spectacular.
There's something to that last minuteness of it too, right? Like it just adds to the fun that like I didn't know waking up this morning that I was going to be doing this tonight, and here it is, right?
Yeah. David, what about your? We didn't get your tips on some of those early influencers.
Well, I'll talk about it and it lead me into my question here, right? I mean, I'll give one example of, my parents had these close friends, the Welbers. Their son was like, I don't know, 5 years older than me, 6 years older than me, and was a kid who would like get really excited about whatever he got excited about and would bathe in it. And there was a line of transmission sort of from him to my older brother to me. Through that line of transmission, then I remember my brother ended up getting subscriptions to like Musician Magazine and Guitar Player Magazine. I would just comb through those and look for every little reference. Like I can remember Michael Stipe referencing some other band, and so you'd go and look for that other band, and it was like detective work, right? But there were always friends, there were always people who you looked at, and you're always looking for clues in, is this somebody that I'm going to listen to or not, right? Is it better to have lived in that world where you had to work for it? Or would you rather have had the teenage experience that maybe some kids today have, where like anything that you can possibly imagine is at your fingertips and there are algorithms feeding you the stuff that they know you're going to like because of what you already like? What's the better world?
I think it's hard to judge one-to-one. I personally, even if this wasn't a conversation with you guys about this, and it was a work conversation about programmatic computer algorithm versus human recommendation for whether you prefer Apple Music, which uses more human elements, versus Spotify, which uses an algorithm. Like, I think that there's something about music that, yes, the algorithm can get pretty close, but the algorithm doesn't know why a song is important to me, doesn't know that's the song that was playing at this incredibly important moment in my life, or at this incredibly sad moment in my life. So, I think having access, being able to find, anything is incredible, but just because it's out there doesn't mean that that is being presented to you. You just have to work differently for it now, right? And now there's so much more clutter, right? You're being bombarded with so much that, like, one of my favorite expressions it's not looking for a needle in a haystack. You're looking for a needle in a stack of needles.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right. Yeah.
Finding a needle in a haystack should be relatively easy, right? It's the pokey thing. But, there's just so much coming at you all the time now that, like, to actually be able to distinguish and decipher, like, what's good. I think that some of it might just be bandwagon-esque. Like, oh, this has, 10 million views, or this has 1 billion listens, or whatever. But isn't that kind of the same thing as what we had when, you turn on the radio? Right? Or you watch MTV.
Yeah. I mean, there are always going to be gatekeepers. It's, can you find the right gatekeepers? I mean, you referenced it earlier, right? With knowing reviewers in Rolling Stone or wherever, and knowing who to trust and who not to. And when you find the voice that matters, then all of a sudden that's a guide that's going to help you an awful lot.
It's interesting. There's the Spotify algorithm, feels like it's been really muddled with a lot of stuff that they're pushing. And so when I get my weekly suggestions from them, there's a lot to wade through. But something that's happened is I'll find a song that I really respond to, and I'll think, oh, wow, this band must be really on the move. It's really polished and great, and it speaks to me. And on a couple of occasions, I can think of 2 acts over the last 6 months, when I clicked on the act, expecting to see they had, 300,000 listens and one song over 3 million or whatever it is. They literally had under 2,000 or under 1,000 listens, and it was perfect. And I was like, this is so good. How could they have so little? And I'm like, all right, thank you, algorithm. Like, this band wouldn't have been signed, and if they were, I might not have heard about it. That's working for me. Then there's all this other crap that's getting shoveled at me, and I'm like, stop it with this stuff. So there is an upside to that, but I think in the end, the thrill is when you find an act that speaks to you, like speaks to your soul, and you could have climbed tall mountains and dug through caves to find that thing, or it could have just landed right in your lap because someone told you to listen to this. And either way, if the music speaks to you, it doesn't matter if Brandon called me and gave me the shortcut, or I had to wade through 70 magazines for 2 years to find them. Once they're there and they speak, that's what matters the most. So that's still available now. And, in some really cool ways. So, I love that old discovery, but I'm not bitter that I've got the new ways either.
That's beautiful, Dave. A little tear to my eye. I thought it was poetry. I think we have a parting question for Brandon, don't we?
Yes. In fact, I think we forgot to ask him our most basic question, so let's hit him with 2, and then we'll let him go home. Wife and daughters have not just blown up his phone with vitriol at this point. So, What's the first record you ever purchased?
The first record that I remember buying with my own money, so I think that's my distinction.
Yeah, no, that was implied, yeah.
The first record that I bought with my own money, I know this is going to come as no surprise to you, Dave. Foreigner 4.
Oh, nice.
Right?
Wow. And the street cred just erodes like that.
Right, yeah, immediately.
No, I like Foreigner. I like that record.
So, yeah, I'll give you my Frogger journey of it was Foreigner 4. Then the next thing that stood out that I remember was the first self-titled Asia album. And then from there, then I think there's the story that I told earlier about my brother coming home from camp and kind of introducing. Right. And then the first record, not to say that Foreigner and Asia didn't leave their mark. I could still, to this day, draw the Asia symbol. If you gave me a pen and a piece of paper or a binder, I'd draw it right on the binder.
Yeah.
But the first record that I remember buying that is where I have lived most of my musical life was the Smiths' Hatful of Hollow.
Yeah.
Great one. So the other question we had that we asked ourselves at the beginning of the show was, if you had one forum for music discovery that you could have as your desert island go-to, something from your youth, what would it be?
I think the one that kind of really had the most resonance for me that I would kind of go back to would be 120 Minutes. Okay. Because there was the visual component of seeing the bands and, the videos, hearing songs, but then I don't remember all the hosts across the time that really stood out to me, but Kevin Seal, Dave Kendall, Matt Pinfield, that's the era that I'm thinking of for myself. And each of them had their own unique way of kind of presenting and connecting the culture to the music. And mind you, this could be this was back in the day where it was alternative music or, college music, right? So it could have been anything as disparate as from the Feelies to Community FK, right? Not things that you would normally associate together, but it was anything that wasn't, popular. It really kind of, to me, opened up avenues into all kinds of different things. And then it was just pulling at those threads, right? And following it down into, as far as you wanted to go with it.
Great.
All right. Well, what do you say, David? We normally do a wormhole at this point, but we've gone on for a bit, and people may be sick of hearing you and me.
Oh, no. I think we need to do our little break and do the wormhole just because I think the podcast algorithm demands it. But thank you, Brandon, for having the time to talk with us today. Really enjoyed it. Really helped us piece this together. We do want to give a shout out to the Welcome to the Music Lounge podcast, who have an episode with even more on Brandon's MTV years on their episode with them. Thanks very much.
Absolutely enjoyed it. Really glad you guys had me participate, and fun to think about this stuff and remember some of these fun stories. So thank you so much.
Do you want to plug the store while you're here?
At Soma Sounds Records. SOMA. Yep.
Outstanding. And is the Bowie poster for sale?
The Bowie poster could be for sale. It looks really nice there, but yeah, and most everything in here, with the exception of a few personal collection pieces.
I love that Bowie poster. I'm going to have to buy that.
All right.
All right, guys.
Thanks very much.
We'll see you soon. Bye.
Yeah. So we're back. We still don't have a Wormholes theme, but this is the part of the show where we do the middle-aged dad thing and just describe some exploration of a random topic that we have done over the course of the previous, 2 weeks since the last show. If we're pretending that this is a live show that we tape every 2 weeks. Dave, what do you got for us?
Okay, well, so I have something that I have a feeling could be the source of some ribbing, both now and in the future, especially if you're not familiar with it and then you look it up afterwards. But my wormhole is the Kiffness. Have you ever heard of this?
Nothing.
Okay, so the Kiffness is something that got served up on a YouTube algorithm to me. And it is a South African musician who, it's one guy, and like us, is named David.
As all good people are, yes.
All the great ones, yes. And he basically takes found audio and sets it to music, and it's very catchy, it's very upbeat, it's fun, it's quirky, it's...
Like what kind of found audio?
Well, I'm going to just go with what looped me in. It was cats. He finds these viral recordings of cats that are seemingly making weird sounds that he then translates to words like Sometimes I'm Alone is one, which is a cat, screeching at something that could be loosely interpreted as that. And then he auto-tunes them and sets it to music. I saw one comment on one of them that someone said, "This is what the internet was invented for." And I couldn't agree more. They are so quirky and funny and good-natured. They just I had a dark moment a few nights back, and I'm like, you know what I need? I need to listen to some Kiffness, and I put it on, and it just righted my mood right away.
I will be looking this up.
Yeah. So look, he also does mashups, and all these other musicians from all over the world will send him in add-ons to it. So it's very funny and really good. He goes on tour. He just did a US tour and was selling out. And
we missed it.
And yes, I did too. I came to Dallas. And also there's one that you should particularly look at, which is, I can't remember what it's called, but it's a blind Turkish street musician, a man with a drum, very high speed, and it's some kind of polka that turns out to be Finnish. So it's a blind Turkish street musician playing a Finnish polka, and then Kiffness adds on his own music to it, and it is unbelievably great. And I think it's got 40 million listens or something. This is not a mystery to some, but it's so great. I love it. But you may just watch it and be like, Dave, what is your problem?
It sounds like something that I could spend a lot of time with. So I will be looking into that.
I'll warn you, I told one
as we hit the leave button here. But
I did introduce a friend and his kids and his wife to it. And he came back from a summer vacation so pissed at me because they had gotten so into it that they'd never stopped playing it. And he is so sick of the Kiffness. It just fills him with fury at this point. So if he's unresponsive to me, I threaten him with Kiffness recordings to get him to respond.
That's good. So my wormhole that I dropped into this week should come as no surprise to you, Dave, that it has to do with fashion, because as you know, that's a topic that I spend a lot of time thinking about. As anybody who's watching on YouTube and sees my exciting wardrobe can tell. I happened to read this story in the New York Times about the continuing trend that's been going on for decades now away from people getting dressed up for work or for any other occasion. And anyway, it made passing reference to a phenomenon called Aloha Fridays in Hawaii. And I Googled that and looked it up. I'm always fascinated by these things that you think are traditional things that have existed forever turn out to actually be something that somebody invented to sell product relatively recently. And the Hawaiian shirt turns out to be one of those. They were invented in like the 30s, I think it was, the 1930s, by some clothing manufacturer in Hawaii with, I don't know their background, but it was certainly an Anglo-sounding name. And they started selling these things, and other manufacturers also started picking up on it. And then to promote them, they got the Chamber of Commerce to come up with this idea of Aloha Fridays, when they would get companies to say it was okay to wear these shirts to work, or even encouraged to wear these shirts to work on Fridays, which is then where the whole casual Friday trend came in, which kind of took over the workplace at around the time that we were coming into the workplace, and then became casual every day. But it started with like some guy coming up with these goofy shirts and then convincing people like, hey, let's just have a day where everybody wears the goofy shirts. Like they weren't a part of traditional Hawaiian culture. I just find that funny. But you win the Wormhole prize this week for the Kiffness.
You haven't listened to the Kiffness yet, so I'm handing it right back to you. But right. I do hope you enjoy it.
Have you ever owned a Hawaiian shirt?
Something quasi-Hawaiian, yes. But generally, I tried to leave that to the realm of fat old country club dudes that I tried to steer clear of in my youth. I'd see them a lot at football games or that kind of thing. But now there's a lot of fun in those, and I think the designs have gotten better.
I think I bought one once and wore it one time for a high school dance, and that was it. But that was...
You must have been the life of the party.
Oh, I always was, yeah. I was...
Do you have a tie that was a fish?
No, I never. I would have liked to have had one of those, but I never did. All right. The next show will be dropping in 2 weeks with Margaret O'Mara, a University of Washington historian, author of The Code, fabulous book about the history of Silicon Valley, former New York Times columnist, really interesting person. We're thrilled to have her. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for listening. What should people do if they enjoy the show, Dave?
They should like and subscribe on YouTube and all the socials that we will post at the end. And we appreciate the dozens, if not thousands and millions that are watching now. And
we're up to episode 3, so I've got to think it's at least 1 million.
Yes, absolutely. Also, Stupid Gen X Tricks is produced by the Daves, and we have music from Amana Bassi and art by TJ McCoy. So thank you to them for their glorious work and their huge talents. And yeah,
we'll be back. Thank you.
Good night.